somewhere along the warm edges of the world, where rivers slow down and meet the sea, there is a forest that should not exist. Before we go any further, if you want a brand new Earth topic every single night to fall asleep to, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. These trees grow in salt water. They stand with their roots lifted above the mud, reaching into the air like pale wooden fingers. They live in a place that would kill almost any other tree on Earth. And yet they thrive. They spread. They build whole new worlds at the water's edge. These are mangrove forests, and they are unlike anything else alive on this planet. Picture yourself drifting above the coast of a tropical island. Below you, the ocean is a deep, clear blue. But as you drift closer to shore, the color changes. The water turns green, then brown. Then the land begins to appear. And right there, in that soft, blurry line where the sea and the soil meet, you see them. A thick, tangled mass of trees, half in the water and half on land. Their roots arch out of the mud in great curved loops. Their leaves catch the light and shine like dark green glass. The whole forest seems to hover just above the surface of the water, as if it is floating. That image is real. Mangrove forests grow along the coastlines of more than 100 countries. They stretch across tropical and subtropical regions all over the world, from the Gulf of Mexico to the coast of West Africa to the islands of Southeast Asia. If you added up every mangrove forest on Earth, they would cover an area of roughly 150,000 square kilometers. That is about the size of the entire country of Bangladesh. All of it dense, living, breathing forest standing in the sea. And yet, for all their size, mangrove forests are easy to overlook. They are not dramatic like a mountain range. They do not glow like a coral reef. They are quiet, muddy, tangled. From a distance, they can look almost messy. But spend a little time with them and something shifts. You begin to see the order inside the tangle. You begin to understand what these trees are actually doing. The word mangrove does not refer to a single species of tree. It refers to a whole group of trees and shrubs from many different plant families that have all found similar ways to survive in the same harsh place. Scientists have identified somewhere between 50 and 110 distinct species of mangrove, depending on how strictly you define the group. These plants are not closely related to each other in the way that, say, oak trees and maple trees are related. They simply solved the same problem in similar ways, each arriving at the same answer through millions of years of slow, quiet change. That answer is the root system. The roots of a mangrove tree are the first thing most people notice, and for good reason. They are extraordinary. Some species grow roots that arch out from the trunk and curve back down into the mud, forming a dense cage of wood around the base of the tree. These are called prop roots, and they look like the tree is standing on stilts. Other species grow roots that push straight up out of the mud like small, blunt spikes, sometimes hundreds of them surrounding a single tree. These upward-pointing roots are called pneumatophores, which simply means air carriers. They poke above the waterline so the tree can breathe even when the soil below is completely waterlogged and starved of oxygen. These roots do more than just hold the tree upright. They slow the water down. As tides push in and out through a mangrove forest, the roots act like a comb, catching sediment, trapping particles, building up the ground beneath the trees. A mangrove forest is not just living in the land. It is slowly making more of it. There is something deeply calming about that idea. A tree standing in the sea, quietly building the ground beneath its own feet. Not rushing, not forcing, just growing day after day, tide after tide, adding a little more solid earth to the edge of the world. The mangrove does not fight the water. It works with the water, and in doing so, it creates something that thousands of other creatures depend on completely. That is the story we are going to follow tonight. A forest at the edge of everything, holding the world together one root at a time. Mangrove forests grow in a very specific kind of place. Not deep ocean, not dry land. The narrow strip in between, where salt water and fresh water meet, where the tide rises and falls twice a day, where the ground is never quite solid and never quite wet. This in-between zone is called the intertidal zone, which simply means the area of coastline that sits between the high tide mark and the low tide mark. Most plants cannot survive here. The salt would kill them. The waterlogged soil would suffocate their roots. The constant push and pull of the tide would uproot them entirely. Mangroves not only survive here, they thrive. These forests are found in tropical and subtropical regions, which means the warm band of Earth that wraps around the middle of the planet, roughly between the Tropic of Cancer in the north and the Tropic of Capricorn in the south. Think of a wide belt circling the globe, stretching across parts of Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Americas. That is where mangroves live. They need warmth. They need humidity. They need coastlines where the water is calm enough for their seeds to take hold. Exposed, wave-battered shores are too rough. Mangroves prefer sheltered bays, river mouths, and quiet lagoons where the water moves gently. Right now, mangrove forests cover roughly 147,000 square kilometers of coastline around the world. That number is hard to picture, so think of it this way. That is an area larger than the entire country of Greece. Spread across more than 120 countries, these forests line the edges of continents like a living border between the sea and the land. Indonesia alone holds more mangrove forest than any other country on Earth, with roughly 23% of the world's total. That is nearly 1 in every 4 mangrove trees on the planet, growing along the islands and coastlines of a single archipelago. The trees themselves range widely in size. Some species grow no taller than a shrub, just a few feet high, hugging the waterline in low, dense thickets. Others grow into full-sized trees, reaching 30 or even 40 meters in height. That is as tall as a 12-story building, rising straight out of the shallow water, their canopies spreading wide above the tangle of roots below. Most mangrove forests sit somewhere in the middle, with trees averaging around 10 to 15 meters tall, roughly the height of a 3-story house. From the water, a healthy mangrove forest looks like a dense green wall, unbroken and impossibly lush, rising right out of the sea. There are around 80 recognized species of true mangrove trees in the world. Scientists sometimes debate the exact number because the definition of what counts as a true mangrove versus a plant that simply tolerates salty conditions is still being refined. But roughly 80 species have adapted specifically to live in this intertidal world and nowhere else. They belong to many different plant families, which means mangroves are not one single type of tree that evolved once. Different plants from completely different lineages all arrived at the same remarkable solution to the same impossible problem. Salt, flooding, unstable ground. Each species found its own way to say yes to conditions that would destroy almost anything else. The oldest mangrove fossils ever found are around 75 million years old. That places mangroves in the age of the dinosaurs, growing along ancient coastlines, while Tyrannosaurus rex walked the interior of what would one day become North America. The world has changed enormously since then. Continents have shifted. Sea levels have risen and fallen. Ice ages have come and gone. And through all of it, the mangrove forest has remained, adapting quietly, moving with the changing shorelines, always finding the warm, sheltered, salty edge where it belongs. Today, scientists estimate that the world's mangrove forests are between 50 and 100 million years old as an ecological group, meaning the general type of forest ecosystem has existed in some form for that entire span of time. That is a system older than the Himalayas, older than the Atlantic Ocean as we know it today. There is something quietly staggering about standing at the edge of a mangrove forest and realizing that this kind of place, this exact meeting of salt and soil and root and tide, has existed on Earth since before most of the world's mountain ranges were even born. And yet, for all their age and all their reach, mangrove forests are surprisingly fragile. They exist only in that narrow strip. Move them too far inland and they dry out. Push them too far into open water and the waves tear them apart. They live precisely at the edge. That is their strength and their vulnerability in equal measure. So how does a tree learn to live at the edge of the sea? It starts with the roots. Not the kind of roots you picture when you think of a tree, hidden underground, invisible, quietly drinking from the dark soil. Mangrove roots are something else entirely. They grow outward and downward in great arching curves, like the legs of a spider frozen mid-step. Some species send roots straight up out of the mud, thin and pointed, rising in clusters around the base of the tree, like a crowd of small fingers reaching for the sky. Others grow in dense, tangled networks that spread wide across the water's surface, holding the tree in place against the pull of the tide. These roots are called prop roots in some species, and pneumatophores, meaning air-breathing roots, in others. Both names tell you something true about what these roots actually do. They prop the tree up above the shifting, unstable mud, and they breathe. In most forests, a tree's roots find oxygen in the soil, but mangrove mud is waterlogged and dense, packed so tightly that almost no oxygen can move through it. So the mangrove grew a different solution. Its roots reach up into the air, where oxygen is plentiful, and pull it down into the tree through tiny pores on the root's surface. This is not a small adaptation. This is a complete reinvention of how a tree feeds itself. Scientists believe this root system evolved slowly over millions of years as early mangrove ancestors began pushing into coastal zones that other plants could not survive. The mud was too soft, too salty, too starved of oxygen. Most plants simply died there, but some trees, through tiny genetic changes across countless generations, began to develop roots that could handle the instability. Roots that could anchor in soft ground. Roots that could reach for air instead of waiting for it. Each small change that helped a tree survive long enough to reproduce got passed on. Over time, those changes added up to something remarkable. The arching prop roots of the red mangrove are perhaps the most recognizable. They sweep down from the trunk in graceful curves, touching the water or the mud at multiple points, spreading the tree's weight across a wide area. This gives the tree an almost impossibly stable base in ground that would swallow a fence post hole. The roots interlock with neighboring trees, weaving together into a structure that no single storm can easily pull apart. What one tree cannot hold alone, the forest holds together. And then there are the pneumatophores of species like the black mangrove. These are the thin, pencil-like roots poke straight up from the mud in their hundreds around a single tree. Walk through a black mangrove forest at low tide, and the ground around you bristles with them, pale and smooth, rising just a few inches above the surface. Each one is a breathing tube. Each one has tiny pores called lenticels that open when the tide is out and close tight when the water rises. The tree breathes in, holds its breath, and breathes out again with every tidal cycle. It has matched its own biology to the rhythm of the ocean. This is what makes mangrove roots so extraordinary. They did not simply tolerate a difficult environment. They synchronized with it. The mud itself played a role in shaping this evolution. Mangrove mud is rich in organic matter. The slow accumulation of fallen leaves and dead creatures, and the remains of the forest itself. It is dark and fine-grained, almost silky when wet. It holds water like a sponge. It is also deeply anoxic, meaning it contains almost no free oxygen. Because the bacteria living in it consume whatever oxygen arrives before it can travel far. For most plants, this is a death sentence. For the mangrove, it became the condition that pushed its roots to evolve in ways no other tree has matched. There is something worth sitting within that idea. The very thing that made the environment so hostile, the airless mud, the unstable ground, the constant flooding, is the thing that shaped the mangrove into what it is today. The difficulty was the teacher. The harshness was the forge. Every arching root, every breathing tube, every interlocking tangle of wood and mud and water is the answer to a question the shoreline asked over millions of years. And the mangrove, slowly, patiently, across more time than the human mind can truly hold, answered every one. Now think about what it actually means to drink salt water and survive. For almost every living thing on Earth, salt water is poison. Not slowly, not in large amounts, immediately and completely. When a plant draws salty water up through its roots, the salt pulls moisture out of its cells. The cells shrink. They dry from the inside. The plant dies. This is the basic chemistry of osmosis, the process by which water moves through a membrane from a less salty place to a saltier one. Salt in high enough amounts simply reverses the flow. Instead of water moving into the plant, it moves out. The result is a kind of internal drought, even when the plant is surrounded by water on all sides. The mangrove solved this problem, and it did not solve it in one way. It solved it in several, all at once, each solution working alongside the others, like parts of a quiet, well-built machine. The first solution is filtration. At the very tips of the mangrove's roots, where the root meets the water, the cells are packed so tightly together that they act like an incredibly fine filter. Salt water enters, but the salt itself is largely blocked at the door. Scientists have measured this. In some mangrove species, more than 90% of the salt in the surrounding water is excluded before it ever enters the root. The water that travels up through the tree is nearly fresh. The mangrove does not fight the salt once it is inside. It simply keeps most of it from getting in at all. This filtration system depends on a few key minerals: magnesium and calcium, both forged in the hearts of ancient stars long before our solar system existed, help build the cell walls that make this tight filtering possible. The iron in the muddy sediment around the roots plays a role too, binding with other compounds in ways that affect how nutrients move through the soil. These elements did not originate on Earth. They were created in stellar explosions billions of years ago and scattered across space. Gravity gathered them into our young planet. Time buried them in rock and mud. And now, in the quiet chemistry of a mangrove root, they are still doing work. But filtration is not perfect. Some salt always gets through. And this is where the mangrove's second solution comes in. Certain species of mangrove, particularly those in the genus Avicennia, can actually push salt back out through their leaves. Tiny glands on the surface of the leaf act as pumps. They pull salt from inside the leaf and release it onto the surface, where it forms small white crystals in the sunlight. If you were to run your finger across a mangrove leaf in the right species, you would feel a faint roughness, a thin crust of salt left behind by the tree's own quiet housekeeping. Other species take a different approach. Rather than excreting the salt, they concentrate it inside older leaves. These leaves become the tree's storage containers, holding accumulated salt until the leaf yellows and falls. The tree sheds the salt along with the leaf. The fallen leaf drifts into the water or settles into the mud, and the slow work of decomposition begins again. Water itself is worth thinking about here. The water the mangrove filters and lifts, and uses arrived on this planet in ways scientists are still working to understand. Evidence suggests that much of Earth's water came from icy comets and asteroids that struck the young planet billions of years ago. That same ancient water cycled through oceans and clouds and rain for eons, now moves through the roots of a mangrove tree on a warm tropical shore. It rises through the trunk in thin vessels, pulled upward by the evaporation happening at the leaf surface above. This process, called transpiration, is the same one that moves water through every tree on Earth. But in the mangrove, it is happening in conditions that would stop most trees cold. The energy that drives all of this comes from the sun. Sunlight hits the broad, waxy surface of the mangrove leaf and powers photosynthesis, the process by which the tree turns light and carbon dioxide into sugar. That sugar feeds the tree. It feeds the roots. It feeds the filtering cells and the salt glands and the breathing tubes rising from the mud below. Every part of the system depends on every other part. The sun above, the ancient minerals below, the water that traveled here on comets, the salt that the tree quietly refuses day after day, tide after tide. The mangrove does not struggle against its environment. It has simply learned over millions of years to use every part of it. Salt is everywhere in the mangrove's world. It is in the water that floods in with every tide. It is in the mud below the roots. It is carried on the warm coastal breeze. For most plants, this much salt would be a slow death sentence. Salt pulls water out of plant cells through a process called osmosis, where water moves from areas of low salt to areas of high salt. When salt surrounds a plant's roots, the water inside the plant actually tries to flow outward, away from the roots, and into the salty soil. The plant dries out from the inside, even while standing in water. It is a quiet, invisible force, and it is relentless. The mangrove has found more than one way to answer it. Different species of mangrove have taken different paths to solve the same problem. Some, like the red mangrove, use what scientists call salt exclusion. Their roots act like very fine filters. At the surface of the root, where water enters, the cells are packed so tightly together that salt molecules simply cannot pass through. The water slips in. The salt stays out. It is a kind of biological membrane, a living wall built at the molecular level, and it works with remarkable precision. Studies have shown that red mangrove roots can filter out more than 90% of the salt in seawater before it ever enters the tree. Other species take a different approach entirely. The gray mangrove, found along the coasts of Australia and the Pacific, lets some salt into its system and then pushes it back out through tiny pores on the surface of its leaves. These pores are called salt glands, and if you were to press your finger gently against a gray mangrove leaf on a warm day, you might feel a faint, dry crust. That crust is salt. The tree has collected it from deep in the soil, pulled it up through its trunk, and then quietly expelled it through its skin. The leaf surface glitters faintly in the sunlight, dusted with the evidence of the tree's constant work. Some species do both. They filter at the root and excrete at the leaf, running two systems at once to manage the salt load that their environment never stops delivering. This matters because salt is not just a chemical problem. It is also a pressure problem. The concentration of salt in seawater creates what scientists call osmotic pressure, a pulling force that works against the tree every moment of every day to bring water up from the roots to the leaves. The mangrove must generate enough internal pressure to overcome both gravity and the outward pull of the surrounding salt. The tree does this through transpiration, the evaporation of water from its leaves, which we touched on in the last section. As water leaves the leaf surface, it creates a kind of suction that pulls more water upward through the trunk. The mangrove is constantly running this engine, constantly pulling against the salt, constantly moving water upward against forces that never rest. The energy cost of all this is significant. A mangrove tree spends a large portion of the energy it it makes through photosynthesis, simply managing salt. This is one reason mangroves grow more slowly than many other trees. They are not being lazy. They are doing invisible, exhausting work that most trees never have to do. And yet, over millions of years, this constant pressure has shaped the mangrove into something extraordinary. The same forces that make coastal life so difficult have pushed the mangrove to develop systems of filtering and expelling and managing that no other tree on earth has matched. The salt did not break the mangrove, it built it. There is something quietly wonderful about that. The harshest part of the mangrove's environment, the thing that would kill almost any other tree, became the force that made the mangrove what it is. The salt shaped the roots. The salt shaped the leaves. The salt shaped the slow, careful chemistry happening inside every cell, every tide that rolls in, heavy with dissolved minerals from the deep ocean floor, is also, in a way, the force that carved this tree into existence over deep time. The mangrove stands at the edge of two worlds, the land and the sea, and it belongs fully to both. The salt that the ocean sends in with every wave is not the mangrove's enemy. It is, in a strange and patient way, the reason the mangrove is here at all. The tree has been shaped by the very thing it refuses. And it does this work quietly, leaf by leaf, root by root, tide after tide, in the warm light of a coastal morning. And while the mangrove itself is remarkable, perhaps the most astonishing part of the whole story begins before the tree is even a tree. It begins with the seed. Most trees drop their seeds to the ground as tiny, dry, dormant things. A pine seed, for example, is smaller than a fingernail. It falls, it waits, it hopes for the right conditions. Rain must come. Soil must be ready. Weeks or months may pass before anything happens. The seed is essentially a package of potential, sealed up and waiting for the world to cooperate. The mangrove does not wait. Mangrove seeds germinate while they are still attached to the parent tree. The seed sprouts, grows, and develops into a small seedling before it ever leaves the branch. This process is called vivipary, which simply means live birth, and it is extraordinarily rare among trees. The mangrove seedling called a propagule, is already alive and growing by the time it separates from its parent. It does not need to wait for the right moment. It arrives at the right moment. Picture a small green dart, smooth and firm, about the length of a pencil. Some propagules are longer, closer to the length of a school ruler. Some species produce propagules nearly a foot long. They hang in clusters from the branches, swaying gently in the coastal breeze, already green, already photosynthesizing, already building energy. They are not seeds in the traditional sense. They are seedlings in waiting, ready to root the instant they touch soft mud. When a propagule drops, it can float. This is where the scale of the mangrove story truly opens up. A single propagule can drift on ocean currents for over a year without losing its ability to take root. Scientists have tracked propagules traveling more than 100 miles from the tree that produced them. Some evidence suggests that certain propagules may travel much farther, riding warm ocean currents across open water between continents. The mangrove does not just grow where it stands. It sends its children out across the sea. Think about that for a moment. A seedling the size of a pencil, floating alone on the open ocean, crossing distances that would take a person days to drive, still alive, still ready, waiting for a muddy shore to catch it. If you placed that propagule at one end of a football field, its destination might be somewhere far beyond the stadium, beyond the parking lot, beyond the highway outside. And it makes that crossing on its own, with no help, no soil, no roots, just the salt water it was built to survive. When the propagule finally touches ground, it can anchor itself within hours. The pointed tip drives into soft sediment. Roots begin to form almost immediately. A tree that took a year to arrive can begin establishing itself in a single tide cycle. Compare this to an oak tree, which may take several years of careful growth before it can survive a harsh season on its own. The mangrove propagule arrives fully prepared. It has already done the slow, early work while still hanging from its parent's branch. This strategy makes the mangrove one of the most effective colonizers of coastline on Earth. A single mature mangrove tree can produce hundreds of propagules in a season. A healthy forest of several thousand trees can release millions of propagules into the water each year. Most will not survive. They may wash ashore in the wrong place, or dry out, or be eaten, but enough of them find their way to soft, warm, sheltered mud. And when they do, a new forest begins. The oldest mangrove forests in the world are estimated to be around 70 million years old in terms of the species lineage. The individual trees within a forest are much younger, but some mangrove trees in protected areas have been documented living for over 100 years. A tree that can send its seedlings across the ocean and have them arrive ready to grow is a tree that has been spreading itself across coastlines for an almost unimaginable stretch of time. The scale of the mangrove is not just in its roots, which can spread wider than a house. It is not just in its forests, which together cover roughly 53,000 square miles of coastline around the world. The scale is also in this quiet, patient strategy of sending life out across the water, one small green propagule at a time, trusting the current, trusting the tide, trusting that somewhere out there, a muddy shore is waiting. The mangrove does not conquer coastlines. It simply arrives, ready, and begins. Beneath the mangrove trees, the world changes completely. The water is shallow and warm. The light filters down through the canopy in soft, broken pieces, flickering gold and green as the leaves shift in the breeze. And below the surface, in the dim, sheltered space between the roots, one of the most important nurseries on Earth quietly goes about its work. The roots themselves are something to see. They arch out of the mud in long, curved lines, like the legs of some enormous creature frozen mid-step. Some species send up thin, finger-like projections straight from the mud, called pneumatophores, which help the tree breathe. Others spread wide, tangled arches that hold the tree above the water. Together, they create a kind of underwater maze. A dense, complex world of shadow and shelter that almost nothing can enter from outside, but that small creatures can navigate with ease. The mud between those roots is dark and soft. It smells of salt and decay, which is not unpleasant so much as ancient. That smell is the smell of life breaking down and becoming life again. The mud is rich with nutrients, with tiny organisms, with the slow chemistry of a system that has been recycling itself for millions of years. It is not clean or bright. It is thick and dark and full of possibility. Young fish arrive here first. Hundreds of species use mangrove forests as nurseries, coming to the shallow, root-filled waters to hatch, to grow, and to hide. The roots give them something open water never could, a place where large predators simply cannot follow. A shark cannot swim through a tangle of arching roots. A large fish cannot chase a small one through spaces barely wider than a finger. The young fish move through those gaps easily, feeding on tiny creatures in the mud, growing slowly in the warm water, protected on all sides. Scientists estimate that roughly 80% of the world's commercial fish species spend part of their early lives in mangrove forests or nearby coastal wetlands. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. The fish that end up on dinner tables around the world, the fish that feed millions of people, often began their lives in exactly this kind of quiet, root-filled place. The mangrove nursery is not a side note to the ocean story. It is one of the ocean's most important chapters. Shrimp come here too. Juvenile shrimp gather in the shallow water among the roots, feeding on the organic material that drifts down from above. Crabs move slowly across the mud, picking through the debris. Tiny snails cling to the roots just above the waterline, grazing on algae that grows in thin green sheets across the wood. Every surface in a mangrove forest is occupied. Every inch of root, every patch of mud, every shallow pool has something living in it, or on it, or passing through it. The water itself changes color in a mangrove forest. It takes on a deep amber or tea-brown tone from the tannins, which are natural compounds that leach out of the decaying leaves and wood. This tannin-rich water is slightly acidic, and it carries a faint, earthy color that makes the forest feel even more enclosed, even more separate from the open sea just beyond the tree line. Looking out from inside a mangrove forest, the open water beyond looks almost too bright, too exposed. In here, everything is softer, more hidden. The surface of the water itself is often still, Mangrove forests break the force of waves and wind, so the water inside the forest barely moves except with the slow push and pull of the tide. Leaves fall from the canopy and float on the surface, spinning gently. Small fish rise to the surface and vanish again. The light shifts as clouds pass overhead. It is a place that feels somehow like it is holding its breath. And in a way, it is. The mangrove nursery is a place of waiting. The young fish are waiting to grow large enough to venture out. The seeds drifting in from the ocean are waiting to find a patch of mud where they can take hold. The mud itself is waiting to be built up slowly by the roots and the sediment they catch into new land. Everything here is in the process of becoming something else. The small fish will become large fish. The seedling will become a tree. The mud will become solid ground. That is the quiet work of the nursery beneath the roots. Not dramatic, not fast, just steady, patient, and absolutely essential to everything that comes after. Beneath that still surface, the water holds more life than you might expect. The roots of the mangrove trees drop down into the water in thick, tangled curtains. They arch and cross and loop back on themselves, creating a kind of underwater city made entirely of wood. And that city is full of fish. Many species of fish spend the early part of their lives inside mangrove forests. The roots give them something they cannot find in open water: shelter. A young fish swimming through the open ocean is easy prey. But a young fish tucked inside a maze of mangrove roots is very hard to catch. Larger predators simply cannot fit between the roots. The forest protects the small and the slow and the newly born. Scientists have found that some tropical fish populations depend almost entirely on mangrove forests during their juvenile stage. That means the fish you might catch on a coral reef miles away likely spent its early weeks or months hiding among mangrove roots closer to shore. The reef and the mangrove are connected in ways that are easy to miss. One feeds the other. Remove the mangrove, and the reef begins to lose its fish. The water inside a mangrove forest is rich with food. Leaves fall from the trees and break down in the water. Tiny creatures called microbes organisms so small you cannot see them without a microscope begin to eat the fallen leaves. As they eat, they break the leaves into even smaller pieces. Those pieces become food for slightly larger creatures, like tiny shrimp and small worms. Those creatures become food for small fish. The whole chain starts with a single fallen leaf. This process has a name. Scientists call it the detrital food web, meaning a food chain built from dead and decaying material rather than from living plants eaten directly. In many ecosystems, the energy chain starts with something alive and green. In mangrove forests, much of the energy chain starts with something dead and brown, floating slowly down through the water. It is a different kind of engine, but it runs just as well. Some fish that live in mangrove forests have developed remarkable ways of getting food. The archerfish, a small silver fish found in mangrove forests across Southeast Asia and northern Australia, hunts insects above the water's surface. It spits a jet of water upward with surprising force and accuracy, knocking insects off low-hanging branches and leaves. The insect falls into the water, and the archerfish eats it. Scientists have found that archerfish can hit targets up to 3 meters above the surface. They also account for the way light bends as it passes from air into water, which changes where things appear to be. The fish corrects for this automatically. Mud skippers are another fish that have made the mangrove forest their home in a very unusual way. They are fish that spend a great deal of time out of the water. They use their strong front fins like arms to pull themselves across the mud. They breathe through their skin as long as it stays moist, and they can absorb oxygen through the lining of their mouth and throat. During low tide, you can find them sitting on exposed roots, watching for insects, defending small patches of mud as their territory. They look, in some ways, more like small lizards than fish, but fish they are. The mud skipper is a reminder that life in the mangrove forest is always pushing against limits. The water is brackish, meaning it is a mix of salt and fresh water that shifts with every tide. The oxygen levels in the water are often low. The temperature can swing widely between day and night. Most fish could not survive here, but the species that have adapted to these conditions have found a place with very little competition. The mangrove forest is hard to live in, and that is exactly why it rewards those who can. At night, the underwater world of the mangrove shifts. Some fish that hide during the day come out to feed. The water, already dark from the tannins released by decaying leaves, becomes nearly black. Small crabs move along the bottom. Shrimp drift through the roots. The whole forest hums with quiet, invisible activity. You would not know it from the surface. The water looks still. The roots stand silent. But below, the work continues without pause. The mangrove forest does not sleep, even in the deepest part of the night, even in the lowest, darkest water at the base of the roots. Something is eating, growing, moving, waiting. The forest is always in motion. It just moves in ways that are easy to overlook if you are not paying close attention. Above the waterline, the mangrove forest wakes up in layers. The roots stand still in the gray light before sunrise. The mud holds its quiet. And then, one by one, the birds begin. Mangrove forests are home to hundreds of bird species around the world. Some live here year-round. Others arrive in great seasonal waves, following ancient routes that have not changed in thousands of years. The forest receives them all. It has the food, the shelter, and the space. For birds, a healthy mangrove is one of the richest places on Earth. Herons are among the most familiar visitors. The great blue heron, tall and still as a statue, stands at the water's edge and waits. It does not chase its prey. It watches. When a small fish drifts close enough, the heron strikes with its long neck in a motion almost too fast to see. Then it is still again. The water barely ripples. The heron has been hunting this way for millions of years, and it has not needed to change. Egrets move through the shallows in a different way. They are bright white against the dark tangle of roots, and they wade slowly, stirring the water with their feet to flush out small creatures hiding in the mud. Snowy egrets and great egrets both use mangrove forests as nesting grounds. They build their nests high in the canopy, sometimes in enormous shared colonies called rookeries. Hundreds of birds may nest in a single stand of trees. The noise and the motion of a rookery at dawn is something that stays with you. Roseate spoonbills add a wash of pink to the scene. These birds sweep their flat, spoon-shaped bills back and forth through the water, feeling for small fish and shrimp. Their color comes from the food they eat. The pigments in the crustaceans they consume work their way into the feathers. A spoonbill that eats well glows. A spoonbill that struggles to find food fades. The color itself is a kind of record, a quiet signal of how the forest is doing. Migratory birds bring the outside world into the mangrove. Warblers and shorebirds pass through during their long seasonal journeys between northern breeding grounds and southern wintering areas. They stop in mangrove forests to rest and feed, sometimes for just a few days, sometimes for weeks. The forest becomes a way station, a place of recovery in the middle of an enormous journey. Without it, many of these birds would not survive the trip. The mangrove kingfisher is a small, vivid bird found in coastal forests across parts of Africa and Asia. It perches on a low branch just above the water and watches the surface below. When it sees a fish, it drops straight down, enters the water cleanly, and returns to its branch in seconds. It is precise. It wastes nothing. The kingfisher does not hunt for sport. Every dive is a calculation, and the mangrove gives it the perfect place to work. Ospreys nest in the upper branches of taller mangrove trees. They are fish hunters, and the shallow, root-filled waters of the mangrove are ideal hunting grounds. An osprey circles high, spots a fish near the surface, and then folds its wings and drops. It hits the water feet first and grips the fish with curved talons that have a rough, spiny texture designed to hold slippery prey. It pulls the fish out, adjusts it in its grip so it faces forward into the wind, and carries it back to the nest. The whole sequence is efficient and calm. The birds of the mangrove are not just residents. They are part of how the forest functions. Their droppings are rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, nutrients that feed the trees and the water below. A large nesting colony can significantly change the chemistry of the soil beneath it. The trees near a rookery often grow faster and fuller than trees farther away. The birds feed the forest. The forest feeds the birds. The cycle runs in both directions, and the rhythm of it is tied to the seasons. Nesting peaks in the dry months in many regions, when water levels drop and fish become easier to catch in the shallows. Migratory arrivals follow the tilt of the earth and the length of the days. The tides set the feeding schedule. Everything moves together, each rhythm fitting into the next like gears that have been turning for a very long time. As the morning light spreads across the canopy, the calls of birds fill the air above the roots. The water below is still dark. The mud is still soft. But up here, in the branches and the open sky above the trees, the forest is wide awake. Below the birds, the mangrove world changes completely. The branches and open sky give way to roots and mud and shadow. And here, in this lower world, an entirely different set of creatures makes its home. They cling to bark. They crawl through silt. They wait in the dark water between the roots. This is the world of the mangrove's closest neighbors, and it is every bit as busy as the canopy above. Look closely at the roots themselves. On almost any mangrove root in the tropics, you will find oysters. They attach themselves to the hard surface of the root just above the waterline, growing in dense clusters that can cover the wood completely. These oysters filter the water as they feed, pulling tiny particles of food from the current that passes through. A single oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water in a single day. A whole colony of them, covering dozens of roots across a stretch of forest, cleans enormous amounts of water without any effort at all. The forest does not ask them to do this. They simply do it, and the water runs clearer because of them. Barnacles live here too, just below the oysters, cemented to the roots in pale gray rings. They close their shells when the tide pulls back and the air touches them. When the water returns, they open and begin to feed again. They have been doing this for hundreds of millions of years, long before mangroves existed. And yet here they are, perfectly at home on these roots, part of a system that formed long after their kind first appeared on Earth. Crabs are everywhere in a mangrove forest. The mud crab is one of the largest, with claws strong enough to crack open a shell. It burrows into the soft sediment The most important crab in the forest may be the smaller, less dramatic fiddler crab. The male fiddler crab has one claw that is much larger than the other, which it waves in slow arcs to attract a mate. Scientists have counted dozens of species of fiddler crabs in mangrove forests around the world. They are not just interesting to watch. They are essential. As they dig their burrows into the mud, they turn the sediment over and push oxygen down into soil that would otherwise have almost none. This aeration, this mixing of air into the ground, helps the roots of the mangrove breathe. The crabs tend the forest floor the way earthworms tend a garden. Mud skippers are perhaps the strangest residents of the mangrove edge. They are fish, but they spend a great deal of their time out of the water. They prop themselves up on their front fins and move across the mud in short, quick hops. Their eyes sit high on their heads and can move independently of each other, giving them a wide view of the world above the waterline. They breathe through their skin when they are on land, as long as their skin stays moist. They are not evolving out of the sea in real time, but watching them move across the mud, you can almost feel the deep history of the moment. Life once made a crossing something like this long ago. Snakes move through the roots as well. The mangrove pit viper lives in the branches of mangroves across Southeast Asia, coiled and still, its green scales nearly invisible against the leaves. It waits for small lizards and frogs, and the occasional bird that lands too close. It is a patient hunter in a patient forest. Other water snakes hunt below the surface, threading through the roots in search of fish and crabs. Monitor lizards, large and slow-moving, patrol the banks of mangrove channels in parts of Asia and Africa. They are strong swimmers and will enter the water without hesitation. They eat almost anything, including the eggs of other animals, and their presence keeps populations in check. They are part of what holds the balance. Even the roots themselves become habitat. Tiny shrimp shelter in the spaces between the oyster clusters. Small gobies, fish no longer than a finger, dart between the root bases. Snails graze on the thin film of algae that coats every wet surface. Each creature occupies its own small space, its own small role, and together they form something far larger than any one of them. The mangrove root is not just a root. It is a surface, a shelter, a feeding ground, and a nursery all at once. Every inch of it is occupied. Every inch of it is alive. And the creatures that cling and crawl across it are as much a part of this forest as the trees themselves. Below the roots, below the waterline, below even the tangle of oysters and small darting fish, there is a world that most eyes never see. It is the mud. And the mud of a mangrove forest is unlike almost any mud on earth. Mangrove mud is thick and dark, almost black in color. It smells strongly of sulfur, like struck matches or rotten eggs. That smell is a sign of something remarkable happening beneath the surface. The mud is so packed with decaying leaves and organic matter that the oxygen inside it gets used up almost completely. Scientists call this kind of environment anoxic, which simply means a place with almost no oxygen at all. Most living things cannot survive in it, but some things thrive there. Deep in the mangrove mud, tiny living things called anaerobic bacteria do their quiet work. Anaerobic means they do not need oxygen to survive. These bacteria break down dead plant material in the absence of air, and as they do, they release sulfur compounds. That is where the smell comes from. It is the smell of life breaking things down, slowly and completely in the dark. These bacteria are among the oldest forms of life on Earth. Their ancestors were doing this same work long before plants ever grew on land. The density of life in mangrove mud is staggering. A single teaspoon of that dark, sulfurous sediment can contain millions of individual bacteria. They are invisible to the naked eye, but their combined effect shapes the entire chemistry of the forest floor. They recycle nutrients that would otherwise be locked away. They release compounds that feed the roots above them. Without these microscopic workers, the mangrove forest could not function. The mud also holds an extraordinary amount of carbon. Mangrove soils store carbon at a rate far higher than most forests on dry land. Scientists have found carbon stored in mangrove sediments that is thousands of years old, buried layer by layer as the forest grew, and shed its leaves over centuries. In some places, the carbon-rich mud beneath a mangrove forest runs several meters deep. It is a slow, steady accumulation, built grain by grain and leaf by leaf across enormous stretches of time. The temperature inside the mud stays relatively stable, even as the air above swings between the heat of midday and the cool of night. This makes the mud a refuge. Fiddler crabs dig burrows down into it, retreating from the heat and from predators. Mud skippers, those remarkable fish that breathe air and move across the mud on their fins, use the burrows too. They lay their eggs inside them, where the temperature stays just right for the eggs to develop. The male mud skipper fans air into the burrow with his tail to keep oxygen levels high enough for the young to survive. It is a careful, deliberate act of care in a very extreme place. Some of the most extreme creatures in the mangrove world are the ones that live right at the mud's surface, in the zone where the tide comes and goes. These animals face conditions that would be lethal to most life. They are submerged in salt water for hours, then exposed to direct sun and drying air. The temperature at the mud surface can swing dramatically within a single day. Fiddler crabs have evolved a remarkable solution. They carry a small bubble of air with them into their burrows, using it to breathe when the tide floods in. Their bodies can also slow down their metabolism, using less energy when conditions get harsh. The mud skipper is perhaps the most extreme of all the mangrove's surface dwellers. It is a fish that spends most of its life out of water. It absorbs oxygen directly through its moist skin and through the lining of its mouth. It can climb the roots of mangrove trees using its strong pectoral fins. The fins just behind its head, almost like small arms. It defends territories on the mud flat, doing push-ups to signal rivals. It is a fish behaving like a land animal, and it does so with complete confidence. The mangrove mud, for all its strangeness, is one of the most productive environments on the planet. It is not empty or dead. It is teeming, layered, and ancient. Every dark inch of it is doing something. The bacteria are breaking things down. The crabs are turning the sediment over. The roots are drawing up nutrients. The carbon is being locked away slowly, steadily, year after year. The mud does not look like much from the outside, but beneath its surface, the work never stops. The mud does something else too. Something slow and patient and easy to miss. Over time, the mangrove forest actually builds the ground beneath its own feet. It works like this. The roots of the mangrove, those arching, tangled prop roots reaching down into the water, act like a net. When the tide flows in, it carries tiny particles of silt and sediment with it. Silt is made of very fine grains of soil and clay, smaller than sand, light enough to float. As the water moves through the dense web of roots, it slows down. And when water slows down, it drops what it is carrying. Those fine particles settle gently onto the mud below. The roots hold them there. The tide goes out and the sediment stays. This happens twice a day, every day, for hundreds of years. Layer by layer, the ground rises. Scientists have measured this process in mangrove forests around the world and found that some forests raise their own soil by several millimeters each year. That may sound small, but across a century, it adds up to something real. The forest is very quietly making more land. What makes this even more remarkable is the timing. Sea levels around the world are rising slowly as the climate warms. In many places, mangrove forests are keeping pace. They trap sediment fast enough to lift the ground as the water rises around them. They are not just surviving the change. In some places, they are matching it, step for step, like a slow and careful dance with the sea. The roots themselves add to this process in another way. When old roots die, they do not simply disappear. They break down into organic matter, the soft, dark material that makes soil rich. This adds bulk to the ground beneath the forest. The living roots and the dead ones are both doing the same work, just in different ways. Together, they build something solid out of something that was once open water. There are places in the world where you can see this history written in the land. In parts of Florida, Bangladesh, and the coast of West Africa, there are stretches of solid ground that were once shallow, tidal flats. The mangroves came first. They trapped the sediment. They built the soil. And then, slowly, the the land became stable enough for other plants to take hold behind them. The mangrove forest advanced into the sea and left dry land in its wake. Scientists call this process land accretion, the gradual building up of new ground from sediment and organic matter. The mangrove forest is one of the most effective land builders on the planet. It does not need tools or effort. It simply grows, and the land follows. There is something almost impossible to believe about the scale of this. A single mangrove tree, with its spreading root system, can trap hundreds of pounds of sediment over its lifetime. Multiply that by a forest of thousands of trees growing for centuries, and the numbers become very large. Whole coastlines have been shaped by this quiet, steady accumulation. Maps from 200 years ago show coastlines that look different from the ones we have today, partly because the mangroves kept building. The sediment that settles beneath the roots is not just dirt. It carries nutrients, minerals, and organic particles from far inland, washed down by rivers and carried by currents. The mangrove forest catches all of it. It holds the nutrients in the soil where the roots can use them. It holds the carbon in the ground where it stays locked away. It holds the coastline in place where storms might otherwise tear it apart. And all of this happens without any single part of the system trying to do it. The roots grow because the tree needs to stand. The sediment settles because water slows down. The land rises because particles stack on top of particles. No one planned it. No one directed it. It simply emerges from the way each piece fits with every other piece. The mangrove forest is, in this way, a builder that does not know it is building. It is a land maker that asks for nothing in return. It simply grows at the edge of the sea, doing what it has always done, and the world around it quietly changes. The tide will come in again tonight. It will carry its fine load of silt and clay through the roots. The water will slow. The particles will fall. And somewhere on a mudflat that was open water 100 years ago, the ground will be just a little higher than it was yesterday. For a long time, the people who lived near mangrove forests knew something that the rest of the world did not. Coastal communities across Southeast Asia, West Africa, Caribbean understood that these trees were valuable. They used the wood for building and for fuel. They fished in the shallow water among the roots. They watched the forests hold the shoreline steady through storms. This knowledge was local, practical, and passed down through generations. But the deeper truth about what mangroves were doing beneath the surface, locked inside the mud itself, took scientists much longer to find. The story of that discovery begins with carbon. Carbon is one of the most common elements on Earth. It moves through the air, the ocean, the soil, and every living thing in a slow, endless cycle. When plants grow, they pull carbon dioxide out of the air and use it to build their leaves, their stems, and their roots. When they die and decay, much of that carbon returns to the air. This is how most forests work. But mangroves, scientists slowly began to realize, do something different. The key is the mud. Mangrove soil is thick, dark, and almost completely without oxygen. When plant matter falls into this kind of soil, it cannot break down the way it would in a normal forest. The microbes that usually eat dead leaves and would need oxygen to do their work. Without it, they slow almost to a stop. So the carbon that the mangrove tree spent years pulling from the air gets buried in the mud and stays there. It does not return to the atmosphere. It simply sinks deeper, year after year, building up in layers that can stretch down several meters below the surface. Scientists began to measure this in the latter half of the 20th century. Researchers studying coastal wetlands started taking core samples, long cylinders of mud pulled up from deep in the ground, and analyzing what was inside them. What they found was striking. The carbon stored in mangrove soil was far denser than anything found in most land forests. A single hectare of mangrove forest, an area roughly the size of 2.5 American football fields, can store as much carbon as several hectares of tropical rainforest. The numbers were hard to believe at first. Teams repeated the measurements. The results held. The term scientists now use for this kind of carbon storage is blue carbon. Blue carbon refers to the carbon captured and stored by coastal and ocean ecosystems, including mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrass beds. The name came into wider use around 2009, when a major report from the United Nations Environment Program helped bring the idea to global attention. Before that report, most climate discussions focused on forests on land. The role of coastal ecosystems had been largely overlooked. The report changed that. It made clear that protecting mangroves was not just a local concern. It was a global one. What made the discovery even more striking was the speed at which this carbon can be lost. When mangroves are cleared, the mud is exposed to air. Oxygen rushes in. The microbes wake up. And the carbon that had been locked in the ground for decades, sometimes for centuries, begins to release. A mangrove forest that took hundreds of years to build its carbon store can lose much of it in just a few years after clearing. Scientists estimate that the destruction of mangroves releases carbon into the atmosphere at a rate that rivals some of the most carbon-intensive industries on Earth. This understanding arrived slowly, built from the work of many researchers across many countries, each adding a piece to a picture that grew clearer over time. Soil scientists, marine biologists, climate researchers, and remote sensing specialists, people who study the Earth from satellites, all contributed. They used instruments that did not exist a generation before. They developed new ways of measuring carbon deep in waterlogged soil. They mapped mangrove forests from space to track how much was being lost each year. And what they found, when all of that work came together, was that these quiet trees at the edge of the sea were doing something extraordinary. They were not just holding coastlines together or sheltering young fish. They were holding carbon in the ground, pulling it from the air and burying it in the dark. Still mud where it could stay for a very long time. The mangrove forest had always been doing this. It had been doing it long before anyone thought to look. It simply needed someone to come along, push a tube into the mud, pull it back up, and pay close attention to what was inside. And yet the story does not stop with carbon. The mangrove forest has more surprises waiting, and some of them are written in the very air above the water. Most people think of oxygen as something forests give freely, the way a candle gives light. Trees breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, is true. But mangroves do something that seems almost contradictory at first. In certain conditions, the waterlogged soil beneath a mangrove forest actually releases gases back into the air, including methane and nitrous oxide, two gases that trap heat in the atmosphere. Scientists were surprised when they first measured this. A forest that stores so much carbon also leaks small amounts of warming gases from its flooded roots. The net effect is still strongly positive for the climate. The carbon stored far outweighs the gases released. But the mangrove is not a simple machine. It is a living, breathing system full of competing forces. The microbes in that dark mud are part of the reason. In waterlogged soil where oxygen cannot reach, certain bacteria break down organic matter in a different way. They produce methane as a byproduct, the same gas that comes from swamps and wetlands around the world. Mangrove soils are among the most active microbial environments on the planet. Billions of organisms work in the mud at all times, breaking things down, building things up, cycling nutrients through the system in ways that scientists are still working to fully understand. The mud that looks still and lifeless from above is just beneath the surface, one of the busiest places in any ecosystem on Earth. Here is something else that surprises people. Mangroves actually change the chemistry of the water around them. As their leaves fall and decay, they release tannins, natural compounds that turn the water a deep amber color, like tea. This tannin-rich water flows out into coastal areas and even into the open ocean. It carries dissolved organic carbon, tiny particles of broken down plant material that feed bacteria and small organisms far beyond the forest itself. The mangrove does not just affect the land it stands on. It reaches out into the sea, feeding food chains that begin miles from the nearest root. The color of that water is something to picture. In places like the Florida Everglades or the rivers of Borneo, the channels running through mangrove forests glow a rich, dark brown in the afternoon light. The water is clear, but deeply tinted, the way old glass looks when light passes through it at a low angle. Fish move through it like shadows. The roots above are tangled and silver gray, draped in places with algae and small ferns. The whole scene is quiet and amber and old. Mangroves also affect rainfall. This is one of the findings that researchers did not expect. Large mangrove forests release water vapor into the air through their leaves, a process called transpiration, which is simply the way plants release moisture as part of their normal life. In coastal regions where mangroves grow in dense, wide bands, this moisture contributes to local cloud formation. Some studies suggest that the presence of healthy mangrove forests along tropical coastlines influences how much rain falls inland. Remove the forest, and the moisture cycle shifts. The land behind it can grow drier over time. The mangrove, standing at the edge of the sea, helps water the world behind it. There is one more surprise worth holding for a moment. Mangrove forests produce a kind of foam. When the water around the roots churns during tidal movement, the tannins and organic compounds in the water create a pale, soft froth that collects along the edges of channels and pools. It looks almost like sea foam, but it forms in still, sheltered places far from any wave. Local communities in many parts of the world have watched this foam for generations. Scientists now know it is a visible sign of how much organic material the forest is releasing into the water. It is the forest, in a sense, exhaling. All of this, the methane from the mud, the tannins in the water, the moisture rising into clouds, the foam drifting along quiet channels, comes from a single kind of tree growing in a thin strip between land and sea. Each process connects to the next. The microbes feed the water chemistry. The water chemistry feeds the ocean. The forest feeds the sky. The sky feeds the land. Nothing here is separate. Every part of the mangrove system touches every other part, and together they touch the world far beyond the waterline. The forest breathes, and the ocean breathes with it. And when the storms come, the forest does not run. It holds. Mangrove forests stand at one of the most dangerous places on Earth. They grow right where tropical storms make landfall. They grow where the ocean surges inland. They grow where the wind is strongest and the water is most violent. And yet, they do not simply survive there. They protect everything behind them. When a tropical storm pushes across the open ocean, it builds a wall of water called a storm surge. This surge can rise several meters high. It moves inland like a slow, heavy flood, carrying salt water far beyond the normal shoreline. For coastal villages, for farmland, for freshwater rivers, this surge is one of the most destructive forces in nature. But where mangrove forests stand thick along the shore, that surge loses its power. The roots do it. Those dense, tangled networks of prop roots and cable roots act like a living net. As the surge pushes inland, the roots slow the water down. They absorb the energy of the wave. Scientists have measured this effect carefully. A healthy mangrove belt, about 100 meters wide, can reduce wave energy by up to 70%. The water that reaches the land behind the forest is slower, shallower, and far less damaging than it would have been without the trees. This is not a small thing. In 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami sent walls of water crashing into coastlines across Southeast Asia and South Asia. Researchers who studied the damage afterward found something striking. Villages sheltered behind dense mangrove forests suffered far less destruction than villages where the mangroves had been cleared. The trees had not stopped the tsunami, but they had slowed it. They had broken its force. They had given people precious seconds and precious distance. In some places, that was enough. The mangrove forest connects to the human world in this way, quietly and completely. It does not ask for anything in return. It simply stands there, year after year, absorbing whatever the ocean sends. Wind plays a role too. Mangrove canopies, the thick upper layer of leaves and branches, catch the force of storm winds and slow them before they reach the land behind. The trees bend. They flex. Their roots hold them firm even as the branches whip and shudder. A single mangrove tree can withstand wind speeds that would flatten most other coastal vegetation. And a whole forest of them, standing together, creates a buffer that shields the softer land behind. The connection goes further still. Mangrove forests protect coral reefs. Coral reefs are those vast, colorful underwater structures built by tiny animals called coral polyps. Reefs are fragile. They can be smothered by sediment, the fine particles of soil and sand that wash off the land during storms and heavy rains. Without something to stop it, that sediment flows straight into the sea and settles over the reef, blocking the sunlight the coral needs to survive. Mangrove roots catch that sediment first. They trap it in the mud before it ever reaches open water. Scientists have found that coastlines with healthy mangrove forests have clearer water offshore and healthier coral reefs below the surface. The forest and the reef are partners. The mangrove protects the reef from the land. The reef, in turn, protects the mangrove from the open ocean, breaking the force of large waves before they reach the shore. They shelter each other across the water, two different systems working together without knowing it. Seagrass meadows, those soft underwater fields of grass-like plants that grow in shallow coastal waters, benefit from the same protection. They too need clear water and calm conditions. Where mangroves stand, the water stays clearer, and the seagrass grows thick. And where seagrass grows thick, dugongs and sea turtles come to feed. And where sea turtles feed, they crop the seagrass short, which helps it grow back stronger. One system feeds into the next, and the next, in a long, quiet chain that stretches from the tree roots in the mud all the way out to the open sea. The storm comes, the forest holds, the reef survives, the seagrass grows, the turtles return. Every piece depends on every other piece. The mangrove forest is not just a line of trees at the water's edge. It is a link in a chain that connects the land to the sea to the reef to the creatures that live within it, and all of them together to the health of the coastline that human communities have called home for thousands of years. The storm passes. The forest is still standing, and behind it, the world it protected is still whole. When the sun goes down over the mangrove forest, something remarkable happens. The world does not go quiet. It wakes up. The daytime belongs to the birds and the crabs and the fish moving through the roots in the golden light. But the night belongs to something else entirely. A different set of creatures takes over. A different set of sounds fills the air. And if you were standing at the edge of the water in the dark, you would hear a forest that is very much alive. first thing you might notice is the mud. It makes sounds. Tiny popping and clicking noises rise up from the surface of the sediment. That thick, soft ground beneath the roots. Those sounds come from snapping shrimp, small crustaceans that live in the mud and shallow water. They snap their claws so fast that it creates a tiny bubble. And when that bubble collapses, it makes a sharp crack. Thousands of them snapping at once creates a soft, constant crackle, like a fire burning very far away. Scientists have recorded this sound in mangrove forests around the world. It never really stops. Above the mud skippers are still moving. These are the fish that breathe air, the ones that climb onto roots and prop themselves up on their front fins during the day. At night, they retreat into burrows they have dug in the mud. The males guard these burrows carefully. They have spent weeks building them, shaping them just right, even creating air pockets inside so that their eggs can breathe. The mud skipper is not a creature most people think about, but it is one of the strangest and most patient animals in the mangrove world, and it has been living this way for a very long time. The mangrove forest itself has been changing too, over long stretches of time. Slowly, quietly, in ways that are hard to see unless you step back very far and look at the whole picture. Mangroves have been on this planet for at least 60 million years. Scientists have found mangrove fossils in places that are now far from any coast, in places that were once warm, shallow seas. The world has changed around them. The coastlines have shifted. The seas have risen and fallen. And through all of it, the mangroves have moved with the water, following the edge of the sea wherever it went. This ability to move is one of the most important things about them. Mangroves do not stay fixed in one place the way a mountain does. They migrate. When sea levels rise slowly over thousands of years, mangroves move inland, colonizing new ground, sending their seeds into new mud. When sea levels fall, they follow the water outward. They have been doing this for millions of years, adapting to a planet that never holds still. Right now, the planet is changing faster than it has in a very long time. Sea levels are rising more quickly than mangroves can easily follow. In some places, the forests are keeping up, creeping slowly inland as the water rises. In other places, the land behind them is developed, built over, blocked off by roads and buildings. The mangroves have nowhere to go. The water rises in front of them, and the wall of human construction stands behind them. Scientists call this coastal squeeze, and it is one of the most serious problems facing mangrove forests today. And yet, the mangroves are still here, still growing, still changing. On a long enough timeline, they have survived ice ages and warm periods and shifting continents. They have outlasted creatures far larger and more powerful than themselves. There is something deeply patient about a mangrove forest. It does not fight the tide. It grows into it. It bends with it. It finds a way. Back in the dark, the sounds continue. Somewhere in the branches above the water, a fruit bat lands softly and folds its wings. Fruit bats are important visitors to mangrove forests. They feed on the nectar and fruit of mangrove flowers, and as they move from tree to tree, they carry pollen with them, helping the trees reproduce. One creature's meal becomes another creature's future. The bat does not know this. It is only hungry, but the forest knows, in the way that systems know things, through the slow accumulation of cause and effect over millions of years. The mud pops and clicks. The water laps gently at the roots. The bat moves through the dark canopy overhead. The tide is coming in. The forest is breathing. And somewhere deep in the sediment beneath all of it, the roots are still growing, still reaching, still holding the edge of the world in place. The sun rises differently over a mangrove forest than it does over open water. It comes in slow and golden, filtered through layer after layer of leaves. The light breaks apart as it passes through the canopy. It falls in long, pale shafts down toward the water below. And where it touches the surface, it turns the dark, tannin-stained water a deep amber color, like tea held up to a lamp. This is one of the most beautiful and least seen sights on Earth. That amber color is real. Mangrove water gets its rich brown tone from tannins, which are natural compounds that the trees release from their roots and fallen leaves. Tannins are the same substances that make tea dark and red wine dry. In a mangrove forest, they seep slowly into the water and stain it. The water looks dark, but it is not dirty. It is full of life. Fish thrive in it. Crabs move through it. Tiny creatures too small to see with the naked eye drift through it by the millions. Mangrove forests grow in a band that wraps around the middle of the earth. They are found in tropical and subtropical regions, which means the warm zones that sit close to the equator. They stretch across more than 100 countries. You can find them along the coasts of Southeast Asia, West Africa, the Caribbean, Central and South America, and Australia. Each region has its own species, its own mix of trees, its own particular light. The country with the most mangrove forest in the world is Indonesia. Its coastlines hold roughly a quarter of all the mangroves on Earth. That is an enormous amount of forest. Spread across thousands of islands, these trees form a green fringe along the edges of the land, visible from above as a dark, dense border between the sea and the interior. From the air, they look like a thick green hem sewn along the edge of the islands. Australia has some of the most diverse mangrove forests on the planet. Scientists have recorded more than 40 different species of mangrove trees growing along the Australian coast. In the north, where the climate is hot and wet, the forests grow tall and dense. The light there is intense. It bounces off the water and flickers through the roots. In the drier south, the forests thin out. The trees grow shorter, more spread apart, and the light reaches all the way to the mud. The Sundarbans, which stretch across the coast of Bangladesh and India, form the largest single mangrove forest in the world. They cover roughly 10,000 square kilometers. That is an area larger than the state of Connecticut. The Sundarbans are also home to the Bengal tiger, one of the few tiger populations in the world that has adapted to living in a coastal, waterlogged environment. These tigers swim between islands. They hunt in the shallow water. They are as comfortable in the mangrove as the mud skippers and the crabs. Light behaves strangely in the Sundarbans. The forest is so dense that in some places, very little sunlight reaches the ground at all. The canopy closes overhead like a ceiling. Below it, the air is cool and dim. The roots rise out of the dark water in great arching tangles. The whole place feels ancient and enclosed, like being inside something very old and very alive. In the Caribbean, mangroves grow in clearer, shallower water. Here, the light does something remarkable. It passes through the water and hits the pale sandy bottom below, then bounces back up through the roots. The result is a soft, shifting, underwater glow. Snorkelers who swim among Caribbean mangrove roots often describe the experience as dreamlike. The roots hang down into the lit water like curtains. Small fish drift between them. The light moves with the current. At sunset, mangrove forests change color entirely. The amber water turns orange, then red, then deep purple as the light fades. The silhouettes of the arching roots go dark against the glowing sky. Herons stand still at the water's edge. Egrets settle into the high branches. The whole forest seems to hold its breath for a moment, suspended between the day and the night. Every mangrove forest on Earth catches the same sun, but each one bends that light in its own way, through its own leaves, across its own water, onto its own particular stretch of mud and root and tide. The light is the same. The forest is always different. And yet, from Indonesia to the Sundarbans to the quiet Caribbean shore, the same slow system is at work. The roots are holding. The water is moving. The light is falling. And the forest, in every corner of the world where it grows, is quietly doing what it has always done. And that quiet work is very, very old. Mangrove forests are ancient. The earliest mangrove plants appeared on Earth roughly 75 million years ago. That means mangroves were already growing along warm coastlines while the last dinosaurs still walked the land. They watched the great extinction come and go. They kept growing. They kept holding the shore. Scientists have found fossilized mangrove pollen and leaves in rock layers all across the world. From Egypt to the Caribbean to the coasts of what is now India, these fossils tell a remarkable story. The basic design of the mangrove, those arching roots, that salt filtering system, that ability to live where the land and sea collide, has not changed very much in tens of millions of years. The mangrove a way to survive, and then it kept that way. There is something deeply calming about that kind of permanence. The sounds of a mangrove forest carry that same ancient feeling. Stand at the edge of one at low tide, and the first thing you hear is water. Not crashing waves, not a roaring river, just the slow, steady drip and trickle of tidal water moving through roots. It is a gentle, layered sound, like rain falling through a canopy long after the storm has passed. Each drop finds its own path through the tangled wood. Beneath that dripping, there is a softer sound. Mud, mangrove mud, is alive with tiny organisms, and as the tide pulls back, the surface of that mud makes a faint crackling, almost like the sound of a bowl of cereal just after the milk is poured. Scientists believe this sound comes from the activity of countless small creatures, crabs and worms and microbes, shifting and moving just below the surface. The mud itself seems to breathe. Then there are the roots. When the tide comes in and the water rises around the prop roots, the roots hum. Not loudly, but the movement of water around curved wood creates a low, resonant vibration. Researchers studying mangrove acoustics have recorded this sound and found that it travels through the water. Fish and invertebrates, the small creatures that live among the roots, can detect these low vibrations. The sound of the forest is part of how the forest communicates. Mangroves also carry sound from above. The canopy of a mangrove forest is full of birds, and their calls layer on top of each other in the early morning. Kingfishers make sharp, bright cries. Herons produce low, hollow croaks. In Southeast Asian mangroves, the calls of proboscis monkeys, large reddish primates with distinctive drooping noses, echo across the water at dawn. These monkeys live almost exclusively in mangrove and riverside forests in Borneo. They are strong swimmers. They leap from the branches and enter the water with barely a splash. Their calls carry far across the still morning surface. In the mangroves of the Sundarbans, the vast forest delta shared by India and Bangladesh, the sounds include something far more powerful. Bengal tigers move through these forests. They are strong swimmers, and they hunt in and around the mangrove channels. The Sundarbans is the only place on Earth where tigers live Untitled Forest. Their low, rumbling calls move through the trees at night, mixing with the sound of the water and the calls of spotted deer. It is one of the most extraordinary soundscapes on the planet. Even underwater, the mangrove forest has a voice. Snapping shrimp, tiny crustaceans that live among the roots, produce a sharp cracking sound by closing their claws at high speed. A single snapping shrimp makes a sound like a small spark. A colony of thousands makes a sound like static. A constant, soft roar just below the surface. Researchers have found that this underwater noise is so constant in healthy mangrove systems that it can be used as a measure of ecosystem health. A quiet reef or a quiet root system often means something has gone wrong. Sound, it turns out, is one of the ways scientists now monitor mangrove forests from a distance. Underwater microphones, called hydrophones, can be lowered into the water near mangrove roots to record the acoustic fingerprint of the forest. A healthy system has a rich, layered sound. The snapping shrimp are active. Fish are calling. Water is moving. The mud is alive. When that sound grows thin and flat, it is a signal worth paying attention to. The mangrove forest has been making these sounds for millions of years, long before there were people to listen, long before there were instruments to record. The water moved through the roots. The mud shifted. The birds called across the water, and the forest held the shore quietly in the dark, as it always has. People have always found their way to the mangroves. Long before scientists arrived with instruments and notebooks, communities of people built their lives along these tangled, salt-soaked shores. And the numbers behind those communities are remarkable. Today, scientists estimate that more than 1 billion people live within 100 kilometers of a mangrove coast. That is roughly 1 in every 8 people on Earth. These are not distant, abstract forests. They are the backyards, the fishing grounds, the storm walls, and the food sources of hundreds of millions of human lives. The connection between people and mangroves is not a new thing. It is ancient, and it runs very deep. In some parts of the world, a single mangrove forest supports the livelihoods of thousands of families. In the Sundarbans, the vast mangrove system shared by India and Bangladesh. Nearly 4 million people depend directly on the forest for food, timber, honey, and shelter. The Sundarbans covers roughly 10,000 square kilometers, making it the largest single mangrove forest on Earth. It is a place where tigers still move through the roots at low tide, and where fishing boats push out before dawn into channels that wind between the trees like dark green corridors. The math of what those forests provide is staggering in its simplicity. Researchers who study the value of natural systems have calculated that a single hectare of healthy mangrove forest, an area about the size of 2 football fields, can provide services worth tens of thousands of dollars each year. That includes the fish it shelters, the coastline it protects, the carbon it stores, and the clean water it filters. Across the world's remaining mangrove forests, those numbers add up to hundreds of billions of dollars in natural value. Not because someone put a price on the trees, but because the trees are doing real, measurable work every single day. The fishing numbers alone are extraordinary. Scientists estimate that roughly 80% of the world's commercial fish species spend at least part of their lives in or near mangrove systems. Those root systems, so dense and tangled, act as nurseries where young fish hide from predators and grow strong enough to move into open water, remove the mangroves, and the fish populations in nearby coastal waters often collapse within a few years. The connection is that direct. Honey is another quiet gift. In the Sundarbans and in mangrove forests across Southeast Asia, honey collectors have harvested wild honey from bees that nest in the canopy for generations. The bees feed on mangrove flowers, which bloom in soft clusters of white and yellow. The honey they produce has a faint, salt-tinged sweetness that is unlike any other. In Bangladesh alone, honey collection from the Sundarbans supports thousands of families each year, following routes and seasons that have been passed down for centuries. The numbers around mangrove timber tell a different kind of story. Mangrove wood is extraordinarily dense and hard. It sinks in water rather than floating. Pound for pound, it is one of the most durable natural building materials found in coastal regions. For centuries, communities across Africa Asia, and the Pacific used mangrove poles to build homes, fishing traps, and boats. In East Africa, mangrove poles called boriti were traded across the Indian Ocean for over 1,000 years, carried by wind-powered ships to the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. A single straight mangrove pole could be traded for grain, cloth, or tools. The forests were a form of currency long before anyone called them an ecosystem. What is elegant about all of this is the ratio at the heart of it. Mangroves cover only about 0.1% of Earth's total land surface. They are a thin fringe, a narrow band of trees at the edge of the sea, and yet they support a disproportionate share of the planet's coastal life, human and animal alike. That small fraction of land does an outsized amount of work. It is the same principle that shows up again and again in nature. The most productive places are often the smallest ones. The edges, the boundaries, the places where two worlds meet. The shoreline where salt water and fresh water mix, where land and sea press against each other, where tree roots reach into the tide. That narrow zone is one of the most productive places on the planet. The math is simple. A small area working very hard for a very long time creates something enormous. The communities that built their lives here understood this long before the measurements were taken. They knew the forest was generous. They knew the roots held the shore. They knew the fish came back each season because the trees were still standing. And then the trees began to disappear. It did not happen all at once. It rarely does. The loss of a mangrove forest is often quiet at first. A section of coast is cleared for a shrimp farm. A stand of trees is cut to make room for a resort. A river upstream is dammed, and the fresh water that once fed the forest slows to a trickle. Each loss seems small on its own, but the system that depends on those trees does not see it that way. Mangroves have been disappearing at a troubling rate. Scientists estimate that roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of the world's mangrove forests have been lost over the past 50 years. In some regions, the losses have been even steeper. Southeast Asia, where mangroves once lined thousands of miles of coast, has seen some of the sharpest declines. the forests were cleared to make way for shrimp and fish farms, a practice called aquaculture. The great irony is that the very fish those farms were trying to raise depended on healthy mangroves to survive in the first place. When the trees go, the roots go with them. And when the roots go, the shore begins to move. Those tangled prop roots, the ones that reach down into the mud like fingers gripping the earth, hold enormous amounts of sediment in place. They slow the water. They catch the silt. They build the land up, season after season, year after year. Without them, the coastline erodes. The mud that once anchored the shore washes back into the sea. In some places, land that took centuries to form disappears within a few decades. Whole sections of coast simply dissolve. The fish feel it too. The juvenile fish that sheltered among the roots, the ones that grew up hidden from predators in that warm, shallow water, have nowhere to go. Fishermen who once pulled steady catches from the coast begin to notice the numbers falling. The connection is not always obvious at first. The shrimp farm is there. The fish are gone. It takes time to understand that the farm replaced the very nursery the fish needed to exist. The carbon stored in mangrove soil tells its own difficult story. Mangrove forests lock away carbon not just in their wood and leaves, but deep in the waterlogged mud beneath them. That mud can hold carbon that has been accumulating for thousands of years. When a mangrove forest is cleared and the soil is drained or disturbed, that stored carbon releases into the atmosphere. Scientists have found that destroying a mangrove forest can release carbon at a rate far higher than clearing an inland forest of the same size. The loss is not just local. It reaches into the air above all of us. Storm protection disappears with the trees as well. Coastal communities that once sat behind a living wall of mangroves find themselves exposed. When a cyclone or a surge of floodwater moves inland, there is nothing left to absorb the blow. The waves arrive with their full force. The damage is worse. The recovery takes longer. The people who understood this best were often the ones who had lived beside the forest for generations. They did not need a study to tell them the trees were protecting them. They could feel it. What makes all of this so striking is how precise the conditions have to be for mangroves to exist at all. They need the right temperature. They need the right mix of salt and fresh water. They need tidal movement to bring nutrients and carry waste away. They need stable sediment to anchor their roots. Change any one of those variables too sharply, and the trees struggle. Change several at once, and they cannot recover. The system that looks so resilient, that has survived millions of years of shifting coastlines and rising seas, turns out to be sensitive to the speed of modern change. Rising sea levels press in from one side. Warmer ocean temperatures bring more powerful storms. Pollution from rivers upstream smothers the roots and clouds the water. Development squeezes the forest from the land side. The mangroves are caught between forces, pushing from every direction at once. And yet the forest is not gone. Not yet. In many places, it is still standing. In others, it is slowly coming back. The same qualities that make mangroves remarkable survivors, their ability to colonize bare mud, to filter salt, to build land from almost nothing, also make them candidates for restoration. The forest has been here for 50 million years. It has outlasted ice ages and rising seas and shifting continents. It knows how to hold on. The question now is whether we will give it the chance. Restoration is slow work. It asks for patience in a world that rarely offers it. When scientists and local communities decide to bring a mangrove forest back, the first thing they learn is that you cannot rush the trees. Mangroves grow on their own timeline. Some species add only a few centimeters of height each year. A restored forest that looks like a healthy tangle of roots and canopy may be 10 or 20 years in the making. The work begins long before any tree is tall enough to offer shade. The most common approach is called direct planting. Workers wade into the shallows and press seedlings, or propagules, those torpedo-shaped seeds that fall ready to grow, directly into the mud. It sounds simple. In practice, it is anything but. Scientists are still working out which species to plant where, and in what order. A mangrove forest is not one kind of tree. It is a layered community of many species, each one suited to a slightly different depth of water, a slightly different salinity. plant the wrong species in the wrong zone, and the seedlings simply die. The soil, the tides, the salt content of the water, all of it has to match. This is one of the great unsolved questions in restoration science. Researchers are still building the maps that show exactly which conditions each species needs. They are still learning how those conditions shift across seasons, across years, across the slow arc of a changing climate. Every restored site teaches them something new. Every failure adds a piece to the picture. One of the biggest surprises has been how much the local community matters. In places where the people who live near the forest are involved in planting and protecting it, the trees do better. This is not just a social observation. It is an ecological one. Local fishers and farmers often know the tidal rhythms and the soil conditions better than any outside researcher. They notice when something changes. They catch problems early. Scientists now believe that restoration works best when it is built around that local knowledge, not imported over it. There is also the question of what to do when the conditions that once supported a mangrove forest no longer exist. In some places, shrimp farms or rice paddies were built on top of old mangrove land. The drainage channels were dug. The tidal flow was cut off. Simply removing the farm does not bring the tides back. The hydrology, the way water moves through that piece of land, has to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Engineers and ecologists work together to reopen channels, to restore the gentle push and pull of water that the trees need to survive. This kind of work is expensive and complicated, and scientists are still refining the methods. Even when restoration succeeds, there are open questions about what comes back. A young, restored forest is not the same as an old one. The roots are thinner. The canopy is lower. The soil beneath has not yet built up the deep layers of carbon that an ancient forest holds. The fish and birds and crabs that depend on mature mangrove habitat may not return for decades. Researchers are trying to understand how long it takes for a restored forest to become truly functional again. To filter water, to protect coastlines, to store carbon at the same rate as a forest that was never disturbed. The honest answer is that they are not sure yet. Some scientists are exploring whether restored forests can keep pace with rising sea levels. Mangroves build land by trapping sediment, but they can only build so fast. If the sea rises faster than the forest can grow upward, the trees eventually drown. The question of how much time remains, how much sea level rise is too much, is one that researchers are actively working to answer. The math is different in every location. It depends on local sediment supply, on the rate of rise, on the species present. There is no single answer that fits every coastline. What is clear is that restoration is worth doing. Every hectare of mangrove that returns to health filters water, shelters young fish, and locks carbon into the soil. Every forest that comes back is a piece of coastline that can absorb the energy of a storm surge. The work is imperfect and incomplete and full of unanswered questions. But it is also full of something else, evidence that the forest wants to return. Given even a small opening, the propagules drift in on the tide. The roots find the mud. The canopy begins slowly to close. The trees do not need us to do the growing. They only need us to stop getting in the way, and sometimes to help clear the path. The tides do not stop. They have not stopped in 4 billion years. Every 6 hours or so, the water rises. Every 6 hours, it pulls back. And with each cycle, the mangrove forest exchanges something with the wider ocean. Leaves fall into the water. Nutrients wash in from the land. Tiny creatures ride the current in and out. The forest and the sea are in constant conversation, passing things back and forth like two hands cupped together. Scientists call this exchange outwelling. That is the process by which a coastal ecosystem sends organic matter, broken down leaves, carbon, nutrients, out into the open ocean. Mangrove forests are among the most generous outwellers on the planet. A single hectare of healthy mangrove can export hundreds of kilograms of organic material into the sea each year. That material feeds plankton. Plankton feeds fish. Fish feed everything else. The forest reaches far beyond its own shoreline. Looking forward, researchers are thinking carefully about what the tides will carry in the decades and centuries to come. Sea levels are rising. That much is well established. But the story is not simply one of loss. In some places, mangroves are already moving. They are creeping slowly toward higher ground, colonizing areas that were once too dry or too cold for them. In parts of Florida and along the Gulf Coast, mangrove forests have been pushing northward as winters grow milder. They are following the warmth. They are adapting the way living things have always adapted, by moving toward conditions that suit them. Scientists believe this northward shift will continue. As temperatures rise, the range of mangrove forests may expand into regions that have never held them before. New coastlines may gain the shelter and the carbon storage that mangroves provide. This is not a simple trade for what is being lost elsewhere, but it is a reminder that the forest is not passive. It is always reaching, always testing new ground. Over much longer stretches of time, the picture grows stranger and more wonderful. The continents are still moving. They have been drifting for hundreds of millions of years, and they will keep drifting long after every human city has turned to dust. In roughly 250 million years, scientists believe the continents may converge again into a single landmass, sometimes called Pangea Ultima. The coastlines of that future world will be completely different from anything we know today. But wherever warm, shallow, sheltered water meets sediment-rich land, something like a mangrove ecosystem may find its footing. Life tends to fill the spaces available to it. The conditions that mangroves love are not unique to our moment in time. They are a feature of how oceans and continents interact, and that interaction will continue. The sun itself is slowly growing brighter. Over billions of years, it will expand, and the Earth's surface will change in ways that are difficult to fully imagine. But that is a story measured in timescales so vast they are almost beyond meaning. For now, for the next thousands of years that matter most to the living world we know, the mangrove's future depends on something much closer and more immediate. The choices being made right now on this small, water-covered planet, what the tides carry in and out of a mangrove forest is more than leaves and nutrients. The tides carry possibility. every propagule that drifts in on the current is a small act of faith by the forest itself. Every seed that takes root in new mud is the forest extending its reach. The mangrove does not know about climate projections or policy decisions. It only knows the water, the light, and the soil. It responds to what is there. And what is remarkable after everything is how much it can do with so little. A mangrove seed needs no soil preparation. It needs no fertilizer. It needs no careful planting by human hands. It needs a patch of quiet, shallow water, a little sediment, and time. Given those things, it builds. It filters. It shelters. It stores carbon in the dark mud beneath its roots, carbon that may stay locked away for centuries. It holds the coastline in place against the pull of the sea. The tides will keep coming. The forest will keep reaching. And somewhere out in the warm, shallow water, a small green propagule is drifting right now, turning slowly in the current, waiting for the mud to rise up and hold it still. It does not know what comes next. It only knows how to begin. Think about what that small green seed is made of. Its carbon atoms were forged inside ancient stars, billions of years before the Earth existed. When those stars burned out and collapsed, they scattered their material across space. That material drifted and clumped and cooled over millions of years. Eventually, it became rock. It became ocean. It became soil. And one day, it became a mangrove seed, turning slowly in warm, shallow water, waiting for the mud to hold it still. This is not a small thing. This is the universe folding back on itself. Every atom in a mangrove tree has been part of something else before. The carbon in its roots may once have floated as a gas in the atmosphere of a young Earth. The iron in its cells may have come from a meteor that struck the ocean floor long before the first fish existed. The water it draws up through its roots has cycled through clouds, rivers, glaciers, and the deep sea more times than any scientist could count. Nothing here is new. Everything here is borrowed, used, passed on, and used again. That is the quiet truth at the center of the mangrove forest. The leaves fall into the water. Bacteria and fungi break them down into tiny particles called detritus, which are fragments of organic matter so small you cannot see them without a microscope. Those particles feed small crustaceans and worms. The crustaceans feed small fish. The small fish feed larger fish. The larger fish feed herons, ospreys, and dolphins. And when those animals die, their bodies sink into the mud and the bacteria begin again. The same carbon, the same nitrogen, the same phosphorus, cycling through body after body, generation after generation, in a loop that has no clear beginning and no clear end. Scientists call this a nutrient cycle, but it is easier to picture it as a kind of breathing. The forest breathes in sunlight and carbon dioxide. It breathes out oxygen and organic matter. The ocean breathes those materials back in. The atmosphere holds the balance. Every part of the system keeps every other part alive. The mangrove does not do this alone. Coral reefs offshore depend on the clean water that mangrove roots filter from the land. Seagrass beds nearby depend on the nutrients that mangrove leaf litter slowly releases into the water. Migratory birds that breed thousands of miles away depend on the insects, and small fish that the mangrove forest produces each season. A shorebird resting in a mangrove in Florida may have flown from the coast of South America. The energy it burns on that flight came from a fish. The fish came from the estuary. The estuary was fed by the forest. The connection stretches across an entire hemisphere. This is what makes the loss of mangroves so serious. When a mangrove forest disappears, it does not just take the trees. It takes the nursery for the reef fish. It takes the resting place for the migratory birds. It takes the carbon stored in centuries of dark mud. It takes the buffer that stood between the village and the storm surge. One system holds up many others. When it weakens, the effects ripple outward in ways that are hard to predict and harder to reverse. But the same is true in the other direction. When mangroves recover, the effects ripple outward too. Fish populations rebuild. Water clarity improves. Carbon begins to accumulate again in the mud. Birds return. The coastline stabilizes. Restoration of a single mangrove forest can improve conditions across an entire coastal region. Scientists have documented this in the Philippines, in Kenya, in Mexico, and in dozens of other places where communities have worked to bring the trees back. The mangrove is not separate from the ocean or the atmosphere or the land. It sits exactly at the place where all three meet. It is the hinge point, the place where salt water and fresh water mix, where land is still becoming sea, where the forest and the ocean negotiate a shared edge. Everything that happens in a mangrove forest connects to something larger, and everything larger connects back. The carbon locked in the mud beneath your feet was once a leaf. Before that, it was sunlight. Before that, it was a star. The mangrove seed drifting in the current right now carries that whole long story inside it. It does not know about stars or carbon cycles or coral reefs. It only knows the water, the light, and the mud rising up to hold it still. But everything it does, every root it sends down, every leaf it opens to the sun, is part of something vast and old and quietly, perfectly connected. It only knows how to begin, and somehow that is enough. And so we come to rest here at the water's edge. The tide is going out now, slowly, the way it always does. The roots of the mangrove stand in the shallow water, dark and curved, like the fingers of a hand pressed gently into the seafloor. The mud around them is soft and gray and full of life, too small to see. A heron stands perfectly still near the bank. It has been standing there for a long time. It is in no hurry. The mangrove forest at night is one of the quietest places on earth. The daytime sounds have faded. The kingfishers are roosting. The crabs have pulled back into their burrows. The water moves in small, slow ripples, catching the moonlight and letting it go. Above the canopy, the stars are out. The same stars that were there before the first mangrove seed ever touched the water. The same stars that will be there long after every tide has come and gone. There is something steadying about that thought. The mangrove has been here for roughly 50 million years, long before there were people to name it, or study it, or lose it, or try to bring it back. It has survived ice ages and rising seas and shifting continents. It has watched the coastlines of the world change shape, slowly, over time, the way everything changes slowly over time. and still it stands. Still, it reaches its roots down into the mud and holds on. Scientists have found mangrove pollen preserved in ancient rock layers, which tells us that these trees were growing along warm coastlines tens of millions of years ago. The world they grew in looked very different. The animals were different. The oceans were different. But the relationship between the mangrove and the water was the same. Root down, leaf up, hold the edge. Let the sea come in and go out and stay. That kind of patience is hard to imagine, but the mangrove does not think about patience. It simply grows. Right now, somewhere in the tropics, a mangrove propagule is drifting in warm water. A propagule is the long, torpedo-shaped seedling that certain mangrove species drop directly from the tree. Already alive, already growing. It has been floating for days, maybe weeks. It does not need soil yet. It does not need fresh water. It carries everything it needs inside itself, waiting for the right moment, the right depth of mud, the right stillness of water. When it finds that place, it will stop. It will put down a root, and it will begin. That single seedling, if it survives, will one day shelter fish and crabs and birds. Its roots will slow the water and let sediment settle. Over decades, that sediment will build up. New land will form. Other seeds will find that new land and take hold. The forest will grow outward, inch by inch, year by year, the way it has always grown. Slowly, quietly, without asking for anything in return. The mangrove does not know it is doing any of this. It only knows the light and the water and the mud. But the effects of its growing ripple outward in every direction. Into the ocean, where the fish it sheltered, as juveniles now swim in open water. Into the atmosphere, where the carbon it pulled from the air now rests, locked in the deep, dark mud beneath its roots. Into the lives of the people who live along its shores, who have always known, in some quiet way, that the trees at the water's edge were keeping something safe. The planet is very old, 4.5 billion years old, and in all that time, it has never stopped working. The tectonic plates are still moving right now, so slowly you cannot feel it. The ocean currents are still turning, carrying warm water toward the poles and cold water back toward the equator. The mangrove roots are still filtering salt. The mud is still breathing. The heron is still standing in the shallows, watching the water. You are part of all of this. You are made of the same elements as the mud and the roots and the stars above the canopy. You breathe the oxygen that the mangrove leaves helped put into the air. You are resting now, the way the forest rests, the way the tide rests between its coming and its going. The water is still. The roots are holding. The stars are turning slowly overhead. Everything is connected. Everything is held. You can rest now. Subscribe for a brand new Earth topic every night. One tap, and something wonderful is waiting for you tomorrow. Sweet dreams.